I want you to picture a scene that sounds like it was, ripped straight out of a bizarre Hollywood screenplay.
Okay, color me intrigued.
But I assure you, it is entirely real. So we are at a high-end luxury hotel in Los Angeles. The kind of place where discretion and decorum are just like baked into the exorbitant room rates.
Right, very exclusive.
Exactly. And staying at this hotel is a brilliant young technology executive. I mean, this guy's a certified genius. In his 20s, he designed and patented a key component in Wi-Fi routers.
Wow, okay. So he's not just rich, he's incredibly smart.
Super smart. He started and sold multiple companies. He is flushed with millions of dollars, and he wants absolutely everyone to know it.
Naturally.
He literally walks around the hotel carrying a stack of $100 bills several inches thick, just bragging about his net worth to anyone in earshot.
Oh, that is so uncomfortable.
Right. But the truly cinematic moment happens one afternoon when he calls over a hotel valet. He hands the valet thousands of dollars in cash and gives him a very specific errand.
Which is what?
Go down the street to a jewelry store and buy a handful of solid, heavy $1,000 gold coins.
Wait, what? That is a logistical nightmare for a valet. But I mean, when you're handed that much cash, you run the errand.
You run the errand. So the valet returns with the heavy gold coins. The tech executive gathers his friends, and they walk down to a dock overlooking the Pacific Ocean.
Don't tell me.
Yeah. They don't admire the coins. They don't, store them in a safe. They start throwing them into the water.
You're joking.
Nope. They are skipping solid gold coins into the sea like flat rocks, laughing, cackling, arguing over whose gold coin skipped the furthest before sinking to the bottom of the ocean. Just for fun.
That is insane.
And the behavior doesn't even stop there. Days later, this same executive is in the hotel restaurant and carelessly shatters a custom lamp.
I'm going.
The manager approaches, clearly agitated, and points out that the lamp cost $500 and will need to be replaced.
Which is fair.
Completely fair. But the executive looks at the manager with pure disdain, pulls a massive brick of cash out of his pocket, peels off $5,000, and slams it on the table.
Wow.
And he says, "Here is $5,000. Now get out of my face and don't ever insult me like that again."
I mean, that is the pinnacle of financial hubris right there. It's weaponized insecurity disguised as wealth.
Spot on.
And I think the natural question anyone listening to this story asks is about the sustainability of that worldview.
Yeah.
Like, how long can an ecosystem support an apex predator that burns its own calories just to show off?
And the answer is it can't.
Yeah.
Years later,
Yeah.
it was revealed that this brilliant, patented inventor, multimillionaire executive went entirely, utterly broke.
I can't say I'm surprised.
Right, which brings us to the perfect contrast. I want to leave the extravagance of Los Angeles and take you to rural Vermont. I want to introduce you to a man named Ronald Reed.
Okay, shifting gears.
Major shift. Ronald was the first person in his family to graduate high school, and he had to hitchhike to campus every day just to get there. Yeah. And after serving in World War II, he came home and fixed cars at a local gas station for 25 years. After that, he spent 17 years sweeping floors at a JCPenney.
So a very normal working class life.
Exactly. When he's 38 years old, he bought a two-bedroom house for $12,000, and he lived in that exact same house for the rest of his life. His main hobby wasn't, skipping gold coins into the ocean. It was chopping firewood.
A life defined by quiet utility. I mean, he was a man who essentially blended into the background of his own town.
Precisely. Ronald Reed died in 2014 at the age of 92. And that is when this humble rural janitor suddenly made international headlines.
Because of his will, right?
Yes, because in 2014, over 2.8 million Americans died. Fewer than 4,000 of them had a net worth of over $8 million. Ronald Reed was one of them.
That is just incredible.
In his will, he left $2 million to his stepkids and more than $6 million to his local hospital and library. Everyone who knew him was completely baffled.
Right, because the immediate assumption is that he must have won the lottery. Or maybe he inherited a secret fortune that he never spoke about.
Exactly.
We constantly look for the secret lever, the hidden mechanism that explains an anomaly like that. But with Ronald Reed, the mechanism was entirely mundane.
Yeah, there was no lottery. He simply saved whatever little bit he could from his gas station and janitor salaries. He invested those small savings into blue-chip, dividend-paying stocks. And then he waited.
He let decades pass.
Right. He let tiny incremental savings compound into an $8 million mountain. But what makes this story so critical for our mission today is who was in the news at the exact same time Ronald Reed died. Another man named Richard Fuscone.
Yes. Richard Feascone is the archetype of financial pedigree. I mean, he was everything Ronald Read was not.
Totally.
He was Harvard educated, he had his MBA, he became a massive executive at Merrill Lynch. He was so incredibly successful in the high-stakes world of finance that he retired in his 40s to pursue philanthropy.
Which is the dream, right?
Absolutely. He was routinely featured on 40 under 40 lists, and the CEO of Merrill Lynch publicly praised his impeccable business savvy.
But the mechanisms of his downfall were already in motion. In the mid-2000s, Richard Fuscone borrowed heavily to expand an 18,000-square-foot mansion in Greenwich, Connecticut.
Oh, the leverage trap.
Yeah. We are talking about an estate with 11 bathrooms, 2 elevators, 2 indoor pools, and 7 garages. It required more than $90,000 a month just in basic maintenance.
That's over $1 million a year just to keep the lights on and the grass cut.
Exactly. And then the 2008 financial crisis hit. The high debt and illiquid real estate assets turned his fortune to ash. He went bankrupt.
Just devastating.
Right before Ronald Read, the janitor, left millions to charity. Richard Fuscone, the Harvard MBA, saw his mega mansion sold in a foreclosure auction for 75% less than its estimated value.
And this brings us to the core thesis of our deep dive today into Morgan Housel's remarkable book, The Psychology of Money.
Welcome, everyone.
Yes, welcome. We are looking at the ultimate financial paradox. You and I could spend the next decade searching, and we will never find a story of Ronald Read, the janitor, performing a complex heart transplant better than a Harvard-trained cardiovascular surgeon.
Right, impossible.
You'll never find a story of a gas station attendant designing a more structurally sound skyscraper than a credentialed architect. In hard sciences, in engineering, in medicine, technical expertise is the absolute barrier to entry.
But in the world of money, the barrier to entry is fundamentally different. It is the only field on planet Earth where a rural janitor with zero formal education, no Wall Street connections, and no financial background can comprehensively outperform a Harvard-educated financial executive.
Because doing well with money has very little to do with how smart you are, and absolutely everything to do with how you behave.
Yeah, it's not a hard science like physics where formulas guarantee outcomes. It is a soft skill. So today, we are going to explore the defining principles of wealth, risk, and happiness.
We're going to look at the psychological traps that dictate whether you end up skipping your gold into the ocean of bankruptcy or quietly chopping firewood on a mountain of compounded freedom.
I love that framing. So to understand why the tech executive, the Harvard MBA, and the Vermont janitor experienced such wildly different outcomes, we have to start by examining the foundation of financial decision-making.
Right. We have to look at how human beings form their beliefs about money in the first place. And that begins with a premise that might sound incredibly generous, but is actually deeply analytical. No one is crazy.
I have to admit I struggled with that premise initially.
Oh, really? Why is that?
Well, because when you look at the tech executive skipping gold coins or someone taking out a payday loan at a 400% interest rate, the immediate instinctual word that comes to mind is crazy. It looks like absolute mathematical madness.
It does look like madness from the outside, but the concept here is that every single financial decision a person makes, no matter how objectively destructive it appears on a spreadsheet, is deeply justified by their unique mental model of how the world works.
Okay, that makes sense.
And that mental model is constructed almost entirely from their personal lived history. The source material provides a statistic that completely recalibrates how we should view other people's decisions.
Let's hear it.
Your personal experiences with money make up maybe 0.0000000 lengths of 1% of what has happened in the history of the world. But those microscopic experiences govern roughly 80% of how you think the world works.
That is wild. It's like looking through a keyhole.
Ooh, I like that analogy.
Yeah, imagine you were standing outside a massive, sprawling ballroom. You look through the tiny keyhole in the door. You might see a sliver of a crystal chandelier, a corner of a painting, and maybe a single window. That is your entire reality. But the danger is that you walk away convinced you understand the entire architecture of the room, and you start judging everyone else's description of the ballroom based on your 2-inch slice of reality.
And someone looking through a keyhole on the opposite side of the room sees the orchestra pit and a buffet table. They are completely bewildered by your description of chandeliers.
Exactly.
Let's look at the historical context to see how this actually rewires the brain. Take someone who came of age during the Great Depression in the 1930s and contrast them with a tech worker who entered the job market during the late 1990s dot-com boom.
Night and day difference.
Totally. For the person in the Great Depression, the stock market wasn't a wealth-generating engine, it was an incinerator. They literally watched banks lock their doors. They watched their life savings evaporate overnight because FDIC insurance didn't exist yet to guarantee bank deposits.
That is a crucial distinction. We talk about bank runs today as a theoretical risk, but in the early 1930s, if the bank ran out of cash before you got to the front of the line, your money was simply gone.
Period. Gone forever.
You could read a textbook about the Great Depression. You can look at a chart showing an 89% drop in the Dow Jones. But reading about that fear is not the same as experiencing the visceral terror of coming home to your family, looking your children in the eyes, and realizing the money you needed to feed them has literally vanished into thin air.
Exactly. That lived experience creates an emotional scar tissue that a spreadsheet cannot model. So when that person refuses to invest in stocks for the rest of their life, preferring to hide cash under a mattress, the 1990s tech worker thinks they are crazy.
Right.
The tech worker, whose keyhole view consists of internet stocks doubling every 3 months, views risk as a lack of participation. The depression survivor views risk as participation itself. Neither is crazy. They are just operating on entirely different data sets.
And it's not just extreme black swan events like the Depression, right? The sheer dumb luck of the year you happen to be born dictates massive portions of your financial worldview.
Oh, absolutely.
If you were born in 1950, the stock market essentially flatlined during your formative teens and 20s. Adjusted for inflation, the market went literally nowhere. But if you were born in 1970, the S&P 500 increased almost tenfold during those exact same young adult years.
It's a completely different reality.
Just based on the year you popped into the world, your baseline assumption is either that the market is a stagnant waste of time or a magical compounding machine.
We see this with inflation, too. If you grew up in the 1970s, you remember gas lines. You remember the purchasing power of your paycheck actively melting away week by week. Your financial anxiety is permanently attuned to the threat of rising prices.
Yep.
But if you were born in 1990, inflation was largely a theoretical concept in an economics textbook until, very recently.
This framework that we are all acting rationally based on our localized data sets completely changed how I view something like the lottery.
Oh, that's a great example.
Because Americans spend an astronomical amount on lottery tickets. We spend more on lotto tickets than on movies, video games, music, sporting events, and books combined.
That is staggering.
And the vast majority of those tickets are purchased by people in the lowest income brackets. If you have a comfortable salary, an emergency fund, and a 401k, buying a lottery ticket with a negative expected value seems mathematically insane.
Well, it is mathematically insane. The expected value of a $2 ticket might be 40 cents.
Good.
But we have to look beyond the math to the psychological narrative here.
What's the narrative?
For someone living paycheck to paycheck who cannot afford to fix a broken car, who cannot afford to send their kids to college, and who feels systemically locked out of the compounding wealth engines that the upper class utilizes, the lottery represents something very specific. It is the only socially accessible mechanism to purchase hope.
Wow. They are paying $2 for the temporary feeling of possibility?
Right. They're buying the dream that wealthy people get to experience as a baseline reality.
Now, to be clear to you listening, understanding this doesn't mean we endorse buying lottery tickets as a sound financial strategy.
No, definitely not.
We don't. But recognizing the psychological mechanics forces us to drop the judgment. It forces us to realize that we are all, every single one of us, operating in an environment that is shockingly new.
Very true.
Wait, what do you mean new? Money has been around since antiquity. King Alyattes of Lydia was minting coins in 600 BC. The concept of commerce is as old as civilization.
Well, the concept of exchange is old, yes. But the modern infrastructure of personal finance is practically an infant.
Okay, unpack that for me.
Think about the concept of retirement. The idea that an average person stops working at age 65 and lives comfortably for another 2 decades off of accumulated capital is a post-World War II invention. Before that, you worked until you died, or you relied entirely on your extended family.
That's a great point. Even the tools we use are brand new. The 401k wasn't legally established until 1978. Index funds, the bedrock of modern passive investing, were created by Jack Bogle in the 1970s and didn't gain mainstream traction for decades. The widespread democratization of consumer debt, credit cards, and 30-year mortgages really only exploded in the last half-century.
Exactly. Evolutionary biology tells us that human beings are essentially wild animals navigating a modern world. Dogs were domesticated 10,000 years ago, and they still circle the living room carpet to flatten imaginary tall grass before they lie down.
That is such a funny image, but it's so true.
We are attempting to navigate a high-stakes, deeply complex financial system with only 40 or 50 years of collective societal experience. We are improvising. We don't have the evolutionary software for index funds and compound interest, so naturally we make mistakes. We rely on the wrong signals.
And because we are improvising, and because we are locked into our tiny keyhole view of the world, we are terrible at assessing the invisible forces that actually dictate success and failure. Which brings us to a crucial pivot in how we evaluate outcomes.
And this is a big one.
We are culturally conditioned to attribute 100% of someone's success to their hard work and brilliant decision-making. But in doing so, we completely ignore two massive, invisible siblings that are pulling the strings in the background: luck and risk.
Luck and risk are the dark matter of finance. You can't directly see them on a spreadsheet, but their gravitational pull determines the trajectory of everything. And the clearest way to understand this is by looking at the origin story of one of the most successful individuals in human history, Bill Gates.
Now, nobody is arguing that Bill Gates isn't brilliant or that he didn't work incredibly hard. The man is a visionary.
Absolutely.
But the mathematical luck involved in his origin story is staggering. Gates attended Lakeside School in Seattle starting in 1968. At that time, almost no high schools anywhere in the world had a computer. Even most major universities didn't have the kind of advanced computing access that Lakeside had.
Right. Lakeside was an anomaly because they had a visionary teacher named Bill Dougal who believed students should learn about computers. And they had a mother's club that used the proceeds from an annual rummage sale to lease a teletype Model 30 computer connected to a GE mainframe.
In 1968,
It was revolutionary.
let's break down the sheer geographical and demographic lottery Gates won to be in that room. In 1968, there were roughly 303 million high school-age people in the world. About 18 million of them lived in the United States.
Yep.
Maybe 270,000 lived in Washington state. Just over 100,000 lived in the Seattle area. And only about 300 students attended Lakeside School.
So statistically, Bill Gates had roughly a 1 in a million stroke of luck to be sitting in a room with a terminal, learning to write code, years before the rest of the world even knew what software was.
Exactly. That head start was the compounding advantage of a lifetime. Gates himself has explicitly stated that if there had been no Lakeside, there would have been no Microsoft.
But the story of Lakeside School has a darker, deeply tragic second half that illustrates the other side of the equation. Because Bill Gates wasn't the only brilliant computing prodigy at that school. There was another boy named Kent Evans.
Kent Evans was Gates' best friend.
Mm.
By all accounts, including Gates' own, Kent was every bit as brilliant, every bit as driven, and just as deeply obsessed with computers.
They were partners.
They were. They spent their days debugging code and their nights on the phone plotting out their future, dreaming of becoming CEOs of their own companies. Kent Evans had the exact same 1 in a million luck to be at Lakeside.
But Kent never got to graduate high school. Before his senior year, he died in a tragic mountaineering accident.
It's so sad.
It is. The statistical probability of dying on a mountain in high school in the United States is incredibly low, roughly 1 in a million. Kent Evans experienced 1 in a million risk, perfectly mirroring Bill Gates's 1 in a million luck. They were two phenomenally talented kids who flipped the exact same coin, but it landed on different sides.
This duality is why it is profoundly dangerous to idolize extreme success or to harshly judge extreme failure.
Exactly.
When we look at someone like Warren Buffett or Elon Musk or Bill Gates, the natural instinct is to try and extract a blueprint. We think, if I wake up at 4 a.m., read 500 pages a day, and make the exact same strategic bets they made, I will get the exact same results.
But you can't emulate their luck. You can't manufacture the macroeconomic environment that existed when they launched their companies, and you can't guarantee you won't be wiped out by a random, unpreventable risk.
But I have to play devil's advocate here.
Go for it.
If I'm listening to this, a part of my brain is throwing up a defense mechanism. If luck plays such a massive overriding role, and risk can randomly wipe you out, regardless of how smart your plan is, doesn't that just invite financial nihilism? Why should I meticulously save my money or work hard to build a business if the universe is just spinning a roulette wheel?
It's a completely natural pushback, and it's a trap many people fall into. But recognizing luck is not an excuse for laziness. It doesn't negate the necessity of hard work. Hard work is the ante just to sit at the table.
Right, you still have to play the game.
Acknowledging luck and risk is actually about calibrating your ego and preserving your mental health. It leads to a profound realization. Nothing is ever as good or as bad as it seems.
How does that actually change our daily behavior, though? Like, practically speaking.
It changes how we process outcomes. When you succeed, when you get the promotion or your investment portfolio surges, recognizing the role of luck keeps you humble.
Ah, see.
It prevents you from developing a dangerous overconfidence that makes you think you are infallible, which often leads to catastrophic bets later on. Conversely, when you fail, recognizing the role of risk allows you to forgive yourself.
That's powerful.
It prevents you from internalizing a business failure as a permanent character flaw. You can say, I made a decision with an 80% chance of success, and I simply landed in the 20% downside.
So the actionable takeaway isn't to stop trying. It's to stop looking at the extreme 1 in a billion outliers for our financial advice. We shouldn't study the single lottery winner or the billionaire who bet their entire net worth on one crypto token and won.
Right. We should look for broad, repeatable patterns. For instance, the pattern that people who save a consistent percentage of their income and avoid high-interest debt tend to have more stability. That is a repeatable pattern. Emulating Bill Gates' dropout strategy is playing with fire.
Exactly. Focus on the broad mechanics of wealth, not the specific anomalies. But here is where the psychology gets even more treacherous.
Oh yeah, it gets worse.
Let's assume you do get lucky. You work hard, you make sound decisions, the macroeconomic winds are at your back, and you achieve a significant level of success. You make money. You gain status. What happens then?
You step directly into a brand new, arguably more dangerous psychological trap. The goalpost starts moving.
This is the disease of never enough. And to understand the mechanics of this disease, we have to look at the story of Rajat Gupta. We touched on him briefly earlier, but his trajectory is mind-boggling.
It really is.
Rajat Gupta was born in Kolkata, India. He was orphaned as a teenager. From those incredibly difficult rock-bottom beginnings, he applied himself, got educated, and rose through the ranks of the corporate world to become the CEO of McKinsey & Company.
Which is arguably the most prestigious consulting firm on the planet.
Right. By his mid-40s, Rajat Gupta was worth roughly $100 million.
Let's pause and appreciate that number. $100 million means you have achieved complete, absolute financial invulnerability.
Unimaginable wealth.
You have prestige, you have power, you can sit on the boards of major philanthropies, you can secure the future of your great-grandchildren. You have everything you could possibly need and everything you could possibly want.
But he wanted to be a billionaire?
Yep.
$100 million wasn't enough. It was just a fraction of a billion. He was surrounded by billionaires in his professional life, and compared to them, he felt inadequate.
Which is crazy to think about.
So during the depths of the 2008 financial crisis, while serving on the board of directors for Goldman Sachs, Gupta learned highly confidential information. He learned that Warren Buffett was preparing to inject $5 billion into Goldman Sachs to keep the bank afloat.
In 2008, liquidity was entirely frozen. The subprime mortgage crisis was tearing down institutions daily. A $5 billion lifeline from Buffett was market-moving, universally positive news.
And knowing this before the public did, Gupta immediately called a hedge fund manager friend named Raj Ratnam. He gave him the insider information. The hedge fund traded on it, making millions in illegal profits.
And Rajat Gupta, the orphan boy who fought his way to a $100 million fortune, was convicted of insider trading and sent to federal prison.
He threw away everything he had and needed in a desperate gamble to acquire something he didn't have and didn't need. Why do people do this? Bernie Madoff was a vastly wealthy, highly respected market maker before he turned his firm into a Ponzi scheme.
Exactly. Why do people with millions of dollars risk prison, their reputation, and their families for more millions?
The underlying mechanism is social comparison.
Yeah.
Capitalism is a phenomenal engine for generating two things: wealth and envy.
Envy is a powerful motivator.
The human brain doesn't assess wealth in a vacuum. It assesses wealth relative to its immediate surroundings. If you are a minor league baseball player making $80,000 a year, you feel incredibly successful compared to your friends from high school.
Sure.
But the moment you get called up to the major leagues and share a locker room with guys making $10 million a year, you suddenly feel desperately underpaid.
Rajat Gupta was a centimillionaire, but his social circle consisted of billionaires. The ceiling of social comparison is effectively infinite. There will always be someone with a larger yacht, a higher net worth, or a more prestigious title. If your expectations rise at the exact same pace as your results, you are just running on a treadmill. You exert massive amounts of energy, but you never actually arrive anywhere.
The only way to step off that treadmill is to define a finish line. There is a story in the source material about the author Joseph Heller, who wrote the classic novel Catch-22.
Oh, I love this story.
Heller was at a lavish party on Shelter Island,
Hmm.
hosted by a billionaire hedge fund manager. Heller's friend, the author Kurt Vonnegut, was also there. Vonnegut turned to Heller and said, "Joe, how does it feel knowing that our host makes more money in a single day than your wildly successful novel Catch-22 has made in its entire history?"
And Heller's response is one of the most powerful financial statements ever articulated. He replied, "Yes, but I have something he will never have. Enough."
Enough. Now let's unpack that word because I can hear the objection already. Does having enough mean you just give up? Does it mean you abandon ambition, stop trying to innovate, and just settle for mediocrity?
Not at all. Enough is not a synonym for settling. Enough is an acute awareness of risk. It is the realization that the appetite for more is an insatiable, destructive beast.
It will eat you alive.
If you don't define what enough is, that beast will eventually push you to the point of ruin. It will push you to work 80-hour weeks at the expense of seeing your children grow up. It will push you to take massive, leveraged risks in the market that could wipe out your family's security. It will push you to compromise your ethics, like Rajat Gupta.
Right.
Enough is knowing when the marginal benefit of an extra dollar is no longer worth the marginal risk required to acquire it. Getting the goalpost to stop moving is the hardest but most vital financial skill.
Okay, so if defining enough is the ultimate defensive maneuver, how do we actually build the wealth to get to that point in the first place?
Well, we know that hard work is required, and we know luck plays a role.
But the actual mechanical engine of wealth creation relies on a concept that our brains are fundamentally poorly equipped to understand.
Compounding. Human beings are linear thinkers. Our ancient ancestors needed to calculate linear trajectories to throw a spear or track an animal.
Right, point A to point B.
If I ask you to calculate 8 plus 8 plus 8 plus 8 plus 8, your brain can easily handle that. It's 40. But if I ask you to calculate 8 times 8 times 8 times 8 times 8, your brain short circuits. Exponential growth does not feel intuitive.
The classic example of this, and the one that completely breaks our intuition, is Warren Buffett. We universally recognize Warren Buffett as perhaps the greatest investor of the modern era.
Definitely.
We study his methodology for finding undervalued companies. We dissect his letters to shareholders. We treat his stock-picking ability as the absolute secret to his wealth.
His skill is undeniable, but it is entirely secondary to the true secret of his fortune.
Wait, really?
Yeah. The secret isn't his annual return rate. The secret is his lifespan.
Let's look at the actual math. At the time the book was written, Warren Buffett's net worth was roughly $84.5 billion. Now, how much of that $84.5 billion do you think he accumulated before traditional retirement age?
The answer is staggering. $81.5 billion of his net worth came after his 65th birthday.
That is just wow. Let the weight of those numbers sink in to whoever's listening. He's an $84 billion man, and $81 billion of it materialized while most people are playing golf and drawing a pension.
Yeah.
How is that mathematically possible?
Because Warren Buffett didn't start investing in his 30s. He started investing seriously when he was 10 years old.
10 years old.
If Buffett had been a normal person, if he had spent his 20s exploring the world, started investing at age 30 with a decent nest egg, generate the exact same phenomenal annual returns, and then retired at age 60 to relax, you would have never heard of him.
His net worth would have been a tiny fraction of what it is today. He wouldn't be a household name. The magic wasn't just finding good companies. It was the fact that he sustained a compounding return for 3/4 of a century without ever interrupting it.
The author points out that we overcomplicate investing by looking for the best possible returns every single year. But the highest returns tend to be one-off hits that can't be repeated.
Right, you can't hit a home run every time.
The key to wealth isn't the highest return. It's earning a good, consistent return that you can sustain for the longest period of time. The greatest investing book ever written shouldn't be a 500-page manual on technical analysis. It should just be a single page with a chart of long-term economic growth and a title that says, "Shut up and wait."
Shut up and wait. It's brilliant, but it's excruciatingly difficult to execute. Because in order to wait, you have to survive. You have to survive recessions, bear markets, personal emergencies, and the psychological urge to tinker with your portfolio.
Which brings us to the profound difference between getting wealthy and staying wealthy. They require entirely opposite skill sets.
Getting money requires optimism. It requires taking risks, putting yourself out there, launching the business, or buying the volatile stock. It requires a belief that the future will be better than the present and that you can capitalize on it.
But keeping money, staying wealthy requires the exact inverse. It requires frugality. It requires a baseline level of paranoia. Yeah, an acute, constant awareness that whatever wealth you have generated can be instantly taken away by a shift in the macroeconomic winds or a stroke of terrible luck.
We see the catastrophic failure to shift between these two mindsets in the story of Jesse Livermore. In the early 20th century, Livermore was arguably the most famous, successful stock trader alive. He was a legend.
In 1929, right as the stock market was peaking before the infamous crash that triggered the Great Depression, Livermore made a massive contrarian bet. He shorted the market.
For those who might not trade actively, shorting the market means you're betting that prices will fall. You essentially borrow shares of a stock, sell them at the current high price, and wait.
Right.
When the price drops, you buy the shares back at the cheaper price, return them to the lender, and pocket the difference. It's highly lucrative if you're right, but infinitely dangerous if you're wrong.
And Livermore was right. When the market collapsed in October 1929, completely wiping out a generation of investors and driving some to literally jump out of windows, Livermore was cashing in.
He made a killing.
When the dust settled on the worst week in Wall Street history, Jesse Livermore had made the modern equivalent of roughly $3 billion in a single week.
He had conquered the financial world. He mastered the art of getting wealthy. But that phenomenal success became his absolute undoing.
Making $3 billion while the rest of the world burned made him feel infallible. He thought he was smarter than the market itself. He entirely lost the paranoia required to keep his wealth.
Over the next 4 years, instead of preserving his capital, he took wilder and wilder risks. He made massive, highly leveraged bets.
And the market humbled him, as it eventually humbles everyone who lacks a margin of safety. Livermore lost every single penny of that $3 billion fortune.
Oh, man.
He went deeply into debt, faced public ruin, and tragically ended up taking his own life. He had the gear for the ascent, but he was completely unprepared for the reality of the mountain itself.
I love looking at it like climbing Mount Everest. Getting wealthy is reaching the summit. You push yourself to the limit, you rely on optimism and risk, and you finally reach the peak. You take the photo, plant the flag, and celebrate.
But gravity, the jet stream, and the oxygen levels do not care about your summit photo. Reaching the top is only half the journey.
If you don't immediately switch mindsets and utilize an entirely different set of skills to navigate the descent, you will die on the mountain. Staying wealthy is surviving the descent.
Survival is the perfect word. And survival isn't just about avoiding bad investments. Survival means avoiding the forced interruption of compounding.
What do you mean by forced interruption?
When a recession hits, your portfolio will drop in value. That is normal. But if you have overextended yourself with debt, or if you don't have a cash emergency fund, you might be forced to sell your stocks at the exact bottom of the market just to pay your mortgage.
Huh, I see.
Once you sell, the compounding stops. You didn't survive. The key is to cultivate enough short-term paranoia holding cash, avoiding debt, to keep you alive long enough to exploit the long-term optimism of the market.
So we need to survive. But surviving means we have to prepare ourselves mentally to be wrong. A lot. And this brings us to one of the most counterintuitive aspects of finance, business, and investing.
This is a fun one.
You can be wrong half the time and still make an absolute fortune. This is the concept of winning by losing, driven by what statisticians call tail events.
A tail event is a rare, extreme occurrence that sits at the furthest edges of a bell curve. In many aspects of life, outcomes are relatively evenly distributed. But in finance and business, the vast majority of outcomes, the vast majority of the wealth generated is driven by a tiny fraction of extreme tail events.
Let's use venture capital as an example. A venture capital firm might invest $10 million in 10 different startup companies. They know, statistically, that 6 of those companies will fail completely and go to zero.
Right, they write them off entirely.
3 of them might tread water and return the initial investment. But one company, just 1 out of 10, might turn out to be the next Uber or Airbnb. That one tail event explodes in value, returning 50 times the initial investment.
The single winner completely dwarfs the losses of the 9 failures. We see this in the corporate world, too. Think about the Walt Disney Company in the mid-1930s. Walt Disney was a visionary, but his studio was a financial mess.
They had produced over 400 cartoons, right?
Yep. Some were okay, but most lost money. The company was constantly teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. Then they produced Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs.
Snow White was an unprecedented massive tale event. It was a cultural and financial phenomenon. The revenue from that single movie paid off all of the studio's debts, funded a state-of-the-art new studio lot in Burbank, and basically capitalized the entire foundation of the entertainment empire we know today.
One massive success paid for 400 failures.
This mathematical reality applies to your personal retirement portfolio too.
Mm.
If you buy a broad index fund like the S&P 500, you are buying a tiny sliver of the 500 largest companies in America.
Over a 10-year period, a huge chunk of those companies will stagnate, lose value, or go bankrupt. But your portfolio still grows massively. Why? Because the index also holds the extreme tail events. The Amazons, the Apples, the Microsofts, their exponential gains drag the entire index upward.
Peter Lynch, arguably one of the greatest mutual fund managers in Wall Street history, said that if you are absolutely terrific in this business, you are right 6 times out of 10. That means a legendary world-class investor is making the wrong call 40% of the time.
Think about the grace that affords you. If an airline pilot was wrong 40% of the time, they would be grounded immediately.
Oh, instantly.
If a surgeon operated on the wrong organ 40% of the time, they would be in prison. But an investor can fail nearly half the time and still end up extraordinarily wealthy as long as they survive their failures and let their tail events compound.
Which naturally leads to the ultimate question. We are enduring recessions. We are surviving failures. We are wrestling with our own psychology to let our money compound over decades. Why? What is the actual purpose of accumulating this wealth?
Are we doing it just to buy a larger house with a bigger pool? Are we doing it to buy a Rolex?
The fundamental human drive behind acquiring wealth is the desire to be happy. We believe that more money equals more happiness, but because we don't understand what money is actually capable of buying, we often spend it in ways that make us more miserable.
The source material references the work of Angus Campbell, a psychologist at the University of Michigan who conducted extensive research on human happiness.
What did he find?
He wanted to find the common denominator of joy. And what he found was that the demographics we typically assume are linked to happiness, high income, prestigious education, living in a beautiful geographic location, didn't strongly correlate with actual joy.
But there was one variable that towered above all the rest. The strongest universal denominator of happiness was having a strong sense of autonomy. It was the feeling of having control over your own life.
Campbell summarized it perfectly. He said that having a strong sense of controlling one's life is a more dependable predictor of positive feelings of well-being than any of the objective conditions of life we usually consider.
This is the highest dividend that money pays. The greatest intrinsic value of capital is the ability to wake up in the morning, look in the mirror, and say, I can do whatever I want today. I can work with whoever I want for as long as I want.
Think about the interviews Carl Pellimer conducted. He sat down with thousands of elderly Americans and asked them to reflect on their lives and share their most important lessons.
This part really stuck with me.
When you ask thousands of people at the end of their lives what mattered most, the data you get back is incredibly profound. Not a single person out of thousands said that happiness comes from working as hard as you can to buy premium luxury goods.
Not a single person said it was important to be wealthier than your neighbors. What do they value?
They valued quality friendships, they valued being part of a community, and overwhelmingly, they valued unstructured time with their children. As the book explicitly notes, your kids don't want your money anywhere near as much as they want you.
Money buys time. Time is the ultimate non-renewable resource. Let's look at it mechanically. If you have a small amount of savings, a few $1,000s, you have bought the freedom to take a sick day without the terror of missing rent.
If you have a larger amount of savings, a 6-month emergency fund, you have bought the freedom to walk away from a toxic boss. You don't have to take the very first job offer you get. You can wait for a better opportunity.
If you have a massive amount of savings, you have bought the freedom to retire early and entirely dictate how your remaining decades are spent.
The tragedy of modern finance is that we take this incredibly powerful tool for buying freedom and we use it to buy heavier chains.
Yes. We trap ourselves in high-stress, 80-hour-a-week jobs so we can afford the monthly payments on a luxury car we only drive to the office and a massive house we only sleep in because we're always working. We trade our autonomy for objects.
And why do we do that? Because we fundamentally misunderstand what wealth looks like. We are playing a game of pretend, and this is my absolute favorite concept in the entire deep dive. The man in the car paradox.
Oh man, this one is so good. Morgan Housel shares this brilliant observation from his days working as a valet at a high-end hotel in Los Angeles. Over the years, he parked Ferraris, Lamborghinis, Rolls-Royces, the pinnacle of automotive luxury.
But he noticed a consistent psychological reaction within himself. When a Ferrari pulled up to the curb, he never once looked at the driver and thought, wow, the guy driving that car is so cool, I deeply respect him.
Never. I've felt the exact same way when a sports car revs its engine at a stoplight. You don't admire the driver, you just stare at the car. You imagine yourself driving the car. You imagine people looking at you.
This is the paradox. People spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on luxury items because they want respect, admiration, and status from others. But the observers don't give the driver respect.
The observers simply use the driver's fancy car as a mirror to reflect their own desires for wealth and status. You're buying a Ferrari to shout to the world, "Look at me, I am important."
But the world ignores you, erases you from the driver's seat, and projects their own fantasies onto the metal. It is a complete, utter failure of capital allocation if your goal is genuine respect.
If you want respect and admiration, horsepower will never buy it. Humility, empathy, and kindness generate infinitely more genuine respect than a luxury car ever could.
Understanding this paradox requires us to make the most crucial distinction in personal finance: the difference between being rich and being wealthy. In casual conversation, we use those words interchangeably, but functionally, they are opposites.
Rich is a measure of current income, and it is highly visible. You see the Ferrari, you see the sprawling estate, you see the first-class Instagram photos. Rich people often go out of their way to make sure you know they are rich. It is loud.
Wealth, on the other hand, is silent. Wealth is entirely invisible. Wealth is the money that was not spent on the Ferrari. Wealth is the portfolio of index funds sitting quietly in a brokerage account.
Wealth is the unspent cash in a checking account that provides the option to quit a job or start a business. Wealth is flexibility.
But because humans learn by imitation, this invisibility creates a massive behavioral problem. If you want to become a great tennis player, you watch Roger Federer's technique. You imitate his visible swing.
But if you want to become wealthy, you look around and you can't see wealth. You only see the spending. You see the outward manifestations of being rich. So our brains, logically but incorrectly, conclude that the path to success is to spend money.
Which is the fastest mathematical way to ensure you have less money. If you spend money to show people how much money you have, your wealth is literally decreasing with every transaction.
So how do we break the cycle? How do we build invisible wealth in a culture completely obsessed with visible consumption? The answer is so simple it almost feels anticlimactic, but the psychology behind it is profound. We have to save money. Just save it.
We are usually taught that saving requires a specific goal. Save for a down payment, save for a new car, save for retirement. But the text argues that you don't need a specific reason to save. You should save simply to save.
Because life is inherently unpredictable. Saving is a hedge against life's inevitable ability to surprise the hell out of you. The author provides a definition of saving that completely rewired my brain.
Let's hear it.
He writes, "Saving is the gap between your ego and your income."
Wow, that phrase should be framed on every wall.
It's incredible. But practically speaking, how do we operationalize that? If saving is the gap between ego and income, how do we actively shrink our ego in a world governed by algorithms designed to make us feel inadequate?
That is the ultimate internal battle.
Every single screen we look at, Instagram, TikTok, television commercials, is engineered to inflate our desire for status symbols. How do I differentiate between buying a reliable SUV because my family needs safety, which is utility, versus buying the luxury SUV because I want my neighbors to think I'm doing well, which is ego?
Shrinking your ego requires cultivating a very specific, almost rebellious psychological trait, a propensity to truly not care what other people think about your lifestyle.
That is much easier said than done.
It is. But when you internalize the man in the car paradox, when you fundamentally realize that no one is genuinely impressed by your stuff, the desire to spend on status symbols naturally evaporates. You start optimizing your life for internal freedom rather than external validation.
I love that.
The line between utility and ego becomes clearer when you ask yourself, if nobody else could ever see what I am buying, would I still want it?
If nobody else could see it, would I still want it? That is a ruthless filter. Okay, so let's say you've done the internal work. You shrunk your ego, you are saving aggressively, building up invisible wealth, and optimizing your life for autonomy and freedom.
You now have capital to deploy. You need an investment strategy.
But as we transition into this next phase, we encounter the trap of the perfectly optimized plan. because a mathematically perfect strategy will fail completely if you, a flawed, emotional human being, cannot stick to it when the world goes crazy.
This introduces the friction between being rational and being reasonable. Academic finance is completely obsessed with the rational. If you go to a university and study modern portfolio theory, you will use massive algorithms to find the mathematically optimal allocation of assets to maximize return and minimize volatility.
But human beings are not spreadsheets. We don't actually want the mathematically optimal strategy. We want the strategy that maximizes how well we sleep at night. Being reasonable is far superior to being coldly rational, because a reasonable strategy accounts for the messy reality of human emotion.
You mentioned an analogy about dieting earlier that fits this perfectly.
Yes. Think about the fitness industry. Mathematically, the absolute rationally optimal diet for weight loss might consist of consuming exactly 1,200 calories a day of boiled chicken breast, steamed broccoli, and water. No salt, no sugar, no joy.
Sounds miserable.
That is the rational plan. But if you, a stressed-out human being with a crying toddler and a demanding boss, try to eat that way, you are going to be deeply miserable. Your willpower will snap. By day 3, you will be binge-eating 2 large pepperoni pizzas at midnight.
Because the rational plan failed by ignoring human psychology.
Exactly. But a reasonable diet, say 1,800 calories, you get a piece of dark chocolate after dinner, and you eat pizza on Friday nights. You can actually stick to that for a decade. A reasonable plan you stick with will always outperform a rational plan you abandon on day 3.
It translates perfectly to investing. Mathematically, it is entirely irrational to hold a massive emergency fund of cash in a bank account earning virtually 0% interest when the historical stock market returns roughly 8% annually. Inflation is eating that cash. A spreadsheet will tell you to invest every single dime.
But reasonably, having that massive cash buffer is the emotional shock absorber for your life. When the stock market crashes by 30% and headlines are screaming that the economy is collapsing, that irrational cash is the only thing that prevents you from panic selling your compounding assets.
You pay the invisible cost of inflation as an insurance premium to guarantee you can sleep at night. This connects directly to the absolute necessity of having a margin of safety, or leaving room for error.
Why do we need room for error?
Because we cannot predict the future. We look at historians and treat them like prophets. We study the Great Depression, the inflation of the 1970s, the 2008 housing crash, and we build our financial plans to survive those specific events.
But the most impactful events in history, World War II, 9/11, the 2008 financial crisis, the global pandemic, were impactful entirely because they were unprecedented. They were surprises. They weren't in the historical data models.
If your financial plan requires the future to look exactly like the past, you are going to be completely wiped out by the next unprecedented surprise.
To survive the surprises, you must avoid what the text refers to as Russian roulette syndrome.
Oh, that's a chilling name for it.
In Russian roulette, you have a 5 out of 6 chance of winning. Statistically, an 83% chance of success is a fantastic probability in almost any other context. But the 17% downside is unacceptable because it represents total, unrecoverable ruin.
This is why leverage, taking on debt to invest, is so incredibly dangerous, and why it destroyed Richard Fuscone. Let's break down the actual math of leverage to show why it turns a minor bump into a fatal crash.
Okay, lay it out.
Let's say you have $100,000. You buy a house outright for $100,000. If the real estate market dips by 20%, your house is now worth $80,000. It's annoying, but you haven't lost your home. You just wait for the market to recover. You still have an asset.
Makes sense.
But look at what happens when you introduce leverage. You take your $100,000 and you use it as a 10% down payment to borrow $900,000 from a bank to buy a $1 million property.
Now you control a massive asset.
Right. But if that exact same 20% market dip occurs, the property value drops to $800,000.
You still owe the bank $900,000.
Yeah.
Your $100,000 of equity haven't just dropped by 20%. It has been completely vaporized. You are now $100,000 in the hole.
A routine 20% market correction, which happens all the time, has resulted in a 200% loss of your initial capital. The bank forecloses, you lose everything, and you cannot participate in the eventual recovery. Leverage pushes routine risks into ruinous wipeouts.
So we leave room for error to survive the unpredictable market. But there is another variable we have to leave room for, and this one is entirely internal. We have to leave room for the fact that we are going to change.
The end of history illusion. I absolutely love this psychological concept. It describes a fundamental flaw in human self-awareness.
That's so true, though.
If you ask someone to look back at who they were 10 years ago, they will readily admit they have changed drastically. They will say, wow, I dressed terribly, I cared about stupid things, my goals are totally different. We easily acknowledge our past growth.
But when you ask that same person about their future, they falsely assume that their current self is their final permanent form.
We assume the person we are today is the exact person we will be in 20 years. And this illusion wreaks absolute havoc on long-term financial planning. Imagine a 22-year-old who vows to live out of a modified van and save 90% of their income forever to achieve extreme early retirement.
Or imagine a 30-year-old young professional who commits to working 100-hour weeks for the next 3 decades to make senior partner and buy a mansion.
Both of those are extreme plans based on a snapshot of current desires. But the 22-year-old might wake up at 32 and realize they desperately want to put down roots, start a family, and live in a house with plumbing.
And the 30-year-old grinder might wake up at 45, completely burned out, realizing they haven't spoken to their children in a week and desperate for a quiet life in the country.
If you build a financial plan based on an extreme lifestyle, you are guaranteeing massive regret when your identity inevitably shifts. The lesson here is moderation. Aim for moderate savings, maintain a moderate commute, ensure moderate free time with your family.
Moderation isn't a lack of ambition. It is the strategic preservation of flexibility. It allows the you of tomorrow to pivot without having to dismantle everything the you of today built.
But maintaining a moderate long-term plan requires a tremendous amount of emotional endurance, because investing is not a sterile spreadsheet, it is an emotionally violent roller coaster. Which brings us to the psychological price of admission and the blind spots that derail us when the ride gets bumpy.
The foundational rule of economics is that nothing is free. Every reward has a price. When you walk into a dealership to buy a car, the price is clearly written on the sticker. You hand over dollars, you get the car.
But in investing, the price of admission is not measured in dollars and cents. The price of long-term compounding is measured in volatility, fear, uncertainty, doubt, and regret.
When you invest in the stock market, and it drops 20% in a month, which it historically does with regularity, it feels terrible. It feels like a fine. It feels like you made a mistake, you did something wrong, and the financial gods are punishing you by confiscating your wealth.
But successful investors perform a cognitive trick. They reframe volatility. They do not view a 20% market drop as a fine. They view it as a fee. It is the invisible price of admission you must pay to achieve an 8 to 10% annual return over 3 decades.
If you take your family to Disneyland, you might pay $150 per ticket. When you hand over that money at the gate, you don't feel like you are paying a fine for going to a theme park. You view it as a fee in exchange for the joy of the rides.
Market volatility is the fee for the magic of compounding. But it's so hard to remember that when the market is crashing because we constantly get distracted by taking cues from people who are playing an entirely different game.
This is a major source of financial ruin. Cross-contamination of time horizons. Imagine you are a 30-year-old professional. Your game is saving for a retirement that is 35 years away. You buy a broad index fund and plan to hold it. But one morning, you turn on a financial news network.
And there is a highly paid, very intense analyst screaming that tech stocks are vastly overvalued, corporate earnings are weak, and a massive recession is going to wipe out the market tomorrow. The graphics are flashing red, the music is intense.
Your immediate visceral instinct is to log into your brokerage account and sell everything to protect yourself.
But you have to stop and ask, who is that analyst talking to? That analyst on TV is not talking to a 30-year-old with a 3-decade time horizon. That analyst is talking to a day trader who is highly leveraged. They're talking to a hedge fund manager who has to show a profit to impatient clients by the end of the month.
Right. To a day trader, the fact that a stock might drop 5% tomorrow is a matter of life and death. To the 30-year-old index fund investor, what the stock market does tomorrow is completely mathematically irrelevant.
Never let someone playing a short-term game influence your long-term strategy. You have to know what game you are playing.
But let's be honest. It is incredibly difficult to ignore the screaming analysts, isn't it? Especially if they sound so incredibly smart. Which brings us to a fascinating psychological quirk. The seduction of pessimism.
Optimism often sounds like a sales pitch. If someone says things will generally get better over time, we dismiss them as naive. But pessimism sounds like profound intelligence. John Stuart Mill, the philosopher, noted this way back in the 1840s. He said, "I have observed that not the man who hopes when others despair, But the man who despairs when others hope is admired by a large class of persons as a sage.
It is so true. If I come on this deep dive and say the economy is fundamentally sound, innovation will continue, and the market will be higher in 10 years, you will probably tune out.
Yeah, it's boring.
But if I lower my voice and say, the global debt bubble is entirely unsustainable, hyperinflation is imminent, and the US dollar will collapse within 6 months, you will pull up a chair, take meticulous notes, and think, I am an absolute genius. Why are our brains wired to crave the apocalypse?
Because Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel Prize-winning psychologist, showed that our brains have an evolutionary mandate to amplify threats. Organisms that treat threats as more urgent than opportunities have a significantly higher statistical chance of surviving to pass on their genes.
Oh, that makes perfect sense.
If you are a primitive human and you hear a rustle in the bushes and you assume it's just the wind optimism and it turns out to be a tiger, you are dead. Your genes exit the pool. If you assume it's a tiger pessimism and run away, you survive. We are the descendants of the paranoid.
But in modern finance, this evolutionary shield becomes a massive liability. It completely blinds us to the reality of how progress works. Tragedies and collapses happen instantly. A market crash takes a week, a factory burns down in a day, and because they happen quickly, they dominate the news cycle.
But progress happens incredibly slowly, over decades. Compounding is invisible on a daily basis.
And because progress is slow and quiet, we seek out the loud, pessimistic forecasts. We crave the illusion of control. We desperately want the economy to behave like astrophysics. We want it to be clean, predictable, and governed by strict mathematical laws that can be charted on a blackboard.
But wait, let me push back on this.
Sure.
Because if a highly paid analyst at a major Wall Street bank, armed with supercomputers and terabytes of economic data, comes on television and declares that a recession is coming in Q3, isn't it completely irresponsible for me not to listen? They have the models. They have the PhDs.
It feels irresponsible to ignore them because we confuse the stakes with the probabilities. When the stakes are incredibly high, when we are talking about your life savings, your ability to feed your family, your retirement, we become susceptible to quackery. We assume that because the outcome is vitally important, someone out there must be able to predict it. But the data shows they can't. Remember, 85% of active mutual fund managers underperform a simple, brainless index fund over a 10-year period.
That's a crazy statistic.
These are the smartest, most highly credentialed financial minds on Earth, and they cannot consistently predict what the market will do. The economy is not driven by the laws of physics. It is driven by the messy, unpredictable, emotional decisions of billions of humans. We have to accept uncertainty rather than falling for the comforting illusion of control.
So after tearing down all of these myths, after acknowledging the illusion of visible wealth, accepting the necessity of blind luck, embracing failure through tail events, and realizing that nobody can predict the future, what does a functioning, healthy relationship with money actually look like in the real world?
To answer that, we look at the final section of the book, where Morgan Housel does something very rare in the world of financial advice. He confesses his own personal strategy. He opens up the books on his own family's decisions.
And reading it is like taking a deep breath of fresh air. Because Housel, who has spent his life studying finance, openly admits to making decisions that are mathematically terrible.
He states that his family prioritizes independence above absolutely everything else. They live comfortably, but significantly below their means. But the most fascinating confession is about his house. He paid off his mortgage completely, years early, despite having an incredibly low interest rate.
Which is the ultimate test of rational versus reasonable. Any rational financial advisor looking at a spreadsheet would scream at him.
Let's look at the math. If you have a mortgage with a 3% interest rate, and you have $300,000 in cash, paying off the mortgage guarantees a 3% return by eliminating that debt.
But if you take that $300,000 and invest it in an index fund historically returning 8%, you capture a 5% spread. Over 30 years, that 5% spread compounded on $300,000 equals hundreds of thousands of dollars in lost potential wealth. Mathematically, paying off the mortgage is a massive error.
But Housel says it was the single best financial decision his family ever made. Why? Because the spreadsheet cannot measure the psychological weight of debt. Owning their home outright, with no threat of foreclosure regardless of what happens to the economy, maximized their ability to sleep peacefully at night.
It completely removed a layer of baseline anxiety from their lives. It secured their independence. On paper, it's a mistake. In a human life, it is a triumph of peace of mind.
And that encapsulates the entire philosophy. Money is a soft skill. What works for Morgan Housel might not be the exact prescription for you, but the underlying principle optimizing your finances not for maximum numerical return, but for your own independence and psychological comfort is universal.
In the postscript of the book, Housel provides a brief historical context for the American consumer that really explains why we struggle so much with this today. Following World War II, America experienced a unique era of relative economic equality. A factory worker and a mid-level corporate manager lived remarkably similar lifestyles.
They lived in similar-sized three-bedroom homes, drove similar cars, and vacationed in similar ways.
The cultural expectation became deeply entrenched in the American psyche. We are all roughly in this together, and I should be able to live a lifestyle comparable to the people I see on television and around town. But as the decades progressed, the economy fundamentally shifted.
The knowledge economy exploded. Inequality rose dramatically. The people at the very top of the economic ladder started making exponentially more money than the median worker.
But the cultural expectation, that 1950s baseline assumption, never went away. The person making $80,000 a year today still feels a subconscious societal entitlement to live a lifestyle similar to the investment banker making $900,000 a year because that's the baseline they inherited from their parents' generation.
And how do you bridge the gap between an $80,000 reality and a $900,000 expectation? Use debt. Massive, toxic, keeping up with the Joneses consumer debt.
It is a game you mathematically cannot win. The only way to survive is to consciously choose to step off the field entirely.
Which brings us to the end of this massive journey. We have covered an incredible amount of terrain today, moving from the psychological keyholes of our past to the mathematical realities of compounding.
We've learned that behavior will always trump intelligence when it comes to financial success. We've seen that true wealth is the money you intentionally choose not to spend.
We explored how compounding is a quiet, slow magic that only works if you utilize a survival mindset to endure volatility. We discovered that saving money is simply the gap between your ego and your income.
And most importantly, we redefined the goal itself. The ultimate prize of wealth is the freedom to control your own time.
If you take nothing else away from this discussion, we encourage you to look at your own financial life through a new lens. Look at your bank statements, your credit card bills, and your spending habits. Do not look at them as mathematical errors to be deeply ashamed of.
Look at them as emotional artifacts. They are a historical record of your hopes, your anxieties, your fear of missing out, and your unique keyhole view of the world. Forgive yourself for your past financial mistakes. They weren't character flaws. They were just expensive lessons in the true nature of risk.
The X-ray machine for human behavior is permanently broken, and that is perfectly okay. We are all just trying to navigate this murky, unpredictable landscape with the tools we have.
It's so true.
As we close out this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final lingering thought to mull over. The next time you find yourself standing at a cash register or hovering your mouse over a checkout button to make a major purchase, whether it's a luxury car, a larger house, or an expensive watch, pause for a moment and ask yourself the specific question. Am I buying this item to gain more control over my life? Or am I buying this item to show other people that I have control over my life?
That is a phenomenal question to end on.
Because your honest answer to that question might be the exact difference between merely getting rich and actually being wealthy.